Let me just start from the beginning. Good morning, welcome. I'm Keiko Nakamura from RECNA. Thank you very much for attending the UCS RECNA workshop on nuclear disarmament this morning. So today, we are pleased to welcome very distinguished guests from the UCS to Nagasaki. You're very welcome, and thank you for coming. Okay, now I would like to ask Professor Fumihiko Yoshida, the director of RECNA, to say a few words to welcome you all. Professor Yoshida, please.
Good morning in this room and also online participants. Well, first of all, let me express my grateful mind to all of the participants from the UCS, all the way from US and Tokyo. Thank you very much. Well, probably, unfortunately, we are now moving to new age of turmoil in the world. Middle East, Europe, probably somewhere else also. So as a country located in this region, Northeast Asia, not only about international relations, but also the nuclear issues are quite hot topic. And the topic you discussed today is very, very important for us. So we are, very much looking forward to your intelligent, intellectual, and very, focused presentation and discussions. Anyway, I really appreciate your, you are coming to Nagasaki and helping us to have this workshop this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Yoshida. Okay, now we would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Laura Grego, Senior Scientist of UCS. She will talk about the overview of the US missile defense and the implications. Laura, if I may,
yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, thank you on behalf of our team for this very kind and honored invitation. We're so happy to be here with you and look forward to a lot of discussion. Today, I'd like to talk about ballistic missile defenses and the place that their technology and the role that they play in US strategy. Ballistic missile defenses have been under development nearly as long as have ballistic missiles. And the story of missile defense has been a complex interplay of technology, politics, and often of wishful thinking. But in particular, there's been a conflict about what states want missile defense to do and what technology permits. And to outside observers, the choices the United States makes may sometimes seem confusing or ill-advised. But in these remarks, I hope to explain a bit about how missile defense decisions are made, as well as what some of the technical aspects of the programs. And I'd be happy to talk more detail about technology in the questions, but we do have a short time today. But quickly, in the first decades of the Cold War, the dream of the US and the Soviet Union was to build defenses to free themselves from the vulnerability of long-range nuclear-armed missiles. But that dream gave way when it was clear that each state could build enough missiles and countermeasures to overcome each other's defenses, and at a reasonable cost. The US tried to develop nuclear-armed interceptors to defend some intercontinental ballistic missile sites, but they abandoned the program almost immediately and subsequently refocused the efforts in the late 60s to defending the US from the new Chinese ICBM program. As a way to avoid the temptation to run an offense-defense arms race, the US and the Soviet Union eventually negotiated and concluded the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which strictly limited the deployment of strategic missile defenses and created a strong foundation for arms control, which allowed subsequent treaties to be negotiated to reduce offensive nuclear weapons. That treaty held for 30 years. There have been times of unusual technical optimism, such as when President Reagan envisioned the Strategic Defense Initiative of the 1980s, which revisited the idea of a shield-like defense for the US from the massive Soviet arsenal. But at the time, the unsurmountable technical challenges became clear almost immediately, and the scope of the project was much reduced. In the 1990s, the US turned its focus on defending against small numbers of relatively unsophisticated missiles from non-peer potential adversaries. At that time, that included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. So thus, history shows us that the missions for missile defense were often created in reaction to technical limitations rather than truly considered strategic goals, and that ambitious programs have often eventually given way to much more limited goals. Those goals in the past have included defending missile silos to preserve a retaliatory force in the case of first strike, the defense of priority areas such as the missile defense system around the Moscow area, and finally, defense from a limited strike from a non-peer adversary, which is where we are today. Despite remarks from President Trump in 2019 that the goal of missile defense is to, quote, ensure we can detect and destroy any missile launched against the United States anywhere, anytime, any place, which caused great consternation both in missile defense advocates and skeptics, current and long-standing U.S. policy has been that ballistic missile defense is intended to defend the U.S. homeland from the threat of long-range missiles from Iran or North Korea, primarily North Korea, but definitely not from the larger and more sophisticated missile arsenals of major nuclear powers, Russia and China. The most recent Biden administration missile defense review notes that the U.S. will continue to rely on strategic deterrence to address and deter large ICBM nuclear threats to the homeland. So while technical limitations are an important boundary condition for missile defense, at least in the United States, missile defense is never just a technical question. It often isn't even primarily a technical question. The choices about which systems to pursue and what not to pursue are subject to politics, to industrial and parochial interests, like they are everywhere, and in particulars, the particulars of how U.S. policy is actually made. So while it's true that missile defense is a very political issue in the U.S., there are some broad areas of consensus. There also are areas of strong disagreement. And political consensus can change over time. High-level government policy, including the National Defense Strategy and Missile Defense Review, are important indicators of administration policy, but a lot of other stakeholders have a say. The U.S. Congress has a very important role, for example, as the budgetary authority, and Congress sometimes frustrates an administration's plans for missile defense. Congress sometimes adds its own plans. In general, missile defense in the last decade or two has not been an important issue for Congress or the political parties in the U.S. more generally. And the detailed debates that some of those of you who have been working on these issues for a long time, the debates that were common in the 1990s are no longer common. And generally, both Republicans and Democrats want to be able to tell their constituents that they're taking appropriate action with regard to North Korean missiles, but otherwise would prefer really not to talk about it. It's generally not politically useful for Congress to take strong stands on these issues, except to talk about budgetary, to provide budgetary oversight. So critical discussions about the strategic impacts of missile defenses is not just difficult politically. One of the reasons it's so hard to do in Congress is that much of the expertise has been lost. So these conversations, domestic conversations, are really different than they were 20 years ago. So sometimes there are industrial interests, ideological interests. They shape the debate in limited ways. But these dynamics can help explain some of the technical features of the U.S. missile defense programs. For example, the centerpiece of the U.S. missile defense program is called the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, and that's currently the only system fielded to defend the U.S. territory from ICBMs. And it uses technology that was developed in the 1990s. But in 2002, the fielding of the system was greatly accelerated by President Bush. The Bush administration withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, accelerated the development because of the growing North Korean threat. The basic technology is that there are large interceptors. Currently, there are 44 interceptors in big silos in Alaska and California. They're designed to be notified by forward-based radars, by space-based infrared sensors if if a North Korean missile were to be launched, forward-based radars in Japan would send signals to the US system saying something is being launched. It would cue the tracking radars, which would launch these interceptors from US territory. An ICBM takes about 30 minutes during its journey. The GMD system would propel a small kill vehicle about the size of a file cabinet towards the incoming warhead, and with luck, would collide and destroy it with the force of impact up in the vacuum of space. The GMD system has been in development thus for a couple of decades. We've spent tens of billions of dollars. It is expected to cost around $90 billion all told. It's one of the most expensive Pentagon systems ever developed. But the system has made limited progress. The test record is poor. Decades of work and billions of dollars have been spent, so it makes it very difficult to appraise critically and to challenge politically. There's also very little incentive to make substantive changes to improve it because it would be very costly. The testing rate is very slow, less than once per year, and the tests are set up to succeed, not really to challenge the system and improve it. In 2012, the US National Academies of Science study that looked at missile defense issues widely was deeply critical of the GMD program and recommended that it sort of be not quite started from scratch, but substantially revamped. But there's been little appetite to do that. But essentially, the idea is the US plans to try to stay ahead of the North Korean threat by building up the numbers of the interceptors and the reliability of the current system. I think they admit that it will be a challenge to stay ahead of North Korean missiles. One expects a country that's able to launch, to build nuclear weapons and to indigenously produce ICBMs should be able to develop effective countermeasures against a mid-course system. So I think the 2022 Missile Defense Review came to terms with these technical realities, and rather than centering missile defense as a way to provide an impenetrable shield against North Korean missiles, really talks about missile defense differently than past administrations. It indicates that while US homeland defense is still intended to address offensive missile threats from North Korea, its goals are more modest than an impenetrable shield, and that includes reassuring allies and partners that the US will not be coerced by threats from the homeland, denying an aggressor the ability to execute a small-scale coercive nuclear attack or demonstration, and complicating adversary decision-making by injecting doubt and uncertainty about the likelihood of a successful attack. And finally, mitigating damage should deterrence fail. So that's where we were in 2022. Okay. The last time I gave this talk a few days ago, that's where we landed. But since then, there's been a major congressional report on looking at the strategic position of the United States, and they have urged the United States, in the face of growing Chinese arsenals, that the US may be facing two nuclear peers and may substantially need to revise homeland missile defense, including considering defense against certain types of Russian and Chinese missile threats. So while this has been an era of relative restraint, we may be entering, again, a new era of no treaty restricting these developments, a strategic imperative that the Pentagon sees that we need to build a lot of these things, and at this point, some bipartisan congressional consensus around them. 5 minutes. So. Of course, there are real strategic questions about missile defenses, and they long have. There is a sense that strategic missile defense can, coupled with U.S. Very strong nuclear posture, U.S. ability to launch conventional precision strikes potentially on command and control issues, improvements in satellite-based intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, that the U.S. may be able to, or U.S. may be considering that it may have the ability to launch a first strike, and in combination with those technologies and a robust missile defense, may be able to convince itself it could launch a first strike against countries such as China, for example, that has historically had a much smaller nuclear arsenal. The technical facts don't really support the idea that the U.S. could launch a strike and that missile defense would play a crucial role. especially mid-course defense, which is the centerpiece, the technological centerpiece of homeland missile defense, has some serious technical weaknesses. There's been lots of technical studies. We could talk about those later, but really technically sophisticated adversaries should be able to launch countermeasures that should substantially fool such a system. Very difficult technical problem to solve. Additionally, though, Russia and China do seem to be concerned that they want to make sure that they have a preserved second strike capability, and have developed a number of systems which indicate that they do have this concern. Russia has developed around 6 new delivery systems, including nuclear-armed, nuclear-propulsed cruise missile, hypersonic maneuvering glide vehicles. We see China considering MIRVing its missiles. It's tested what people have considered to be a fractional orbital bombardment system. These are all technologies which are designed to either overwhelm, evade, or penetrate missile defense systems. So that those technical signals tend to suggest that the analysis is correct, that they are really concerned about US overconfidence in its position. Given I have a small amount of time. So one other question I wanted to consider is, I've been talking about mid-course defenses. I won't talk too much technically, but are there missile defense systems one could consider building which don't look like the kinds of things that could counter a Russian or especially a Chinese ICBM threat? And one of those systems that's been considered are boost phase systems that could be located close around North Korea. Given North Korea's geographical position as a relatively small nation surrounded by international waters and airspace, there have been proposals that suggest perhaps sea-based or drone-based or aircraft-based boost phase defenses, which are defenses that would catch launching missiles as they are being launched, ICBMs in the 3 to 5 minutes it takes for them to actively burn. It's quite a challenge. 3 to 5 minutes is very difficult to detect, track, and target a missile. Any such ground-based defense would have to be located actually in China, which I don't think is a realistic possibility today. But there have been technical studies about trying to build boost phase missile defenses around North Korea. I don't think the absence of a development program in the United States indicates necessarily that the U.S. wants to target China. Boost phase missile defense is an extremely challenging technical task, and I think that's an adequate explanation for why we don't currently see those systems. I know that Russia and China have been very concerned about space-based boost phase missile defense, which is another way to get at these quickly launching missiles. The other reason we don't see those programs are they are very, very, very expensive, at least an order of magnitude more expensive than ground-based systems. And they're systems that could be easily countered by an advanced nation that could field anti-satellite weapons. So I think that's a good explanation for why we don't see those. So I guess my bottom line, quickly, since I'm running out of time, but thank you. Strategic missile defenses, as it currently stands, despite decades of effort and billions of dollars spent, it still hasn't yet provided a reliable defense against even a missile fleet that a relatively unsophisticated adversary might field. We haven't demonstrated that that works. And I would argue that a simpler and cheaper approach to reducing vulnerability to nuclear weapons, of course, is to accept limits on strategic defenses that have dubious value in order to secure significant limitations on offensive weapons, the same types of things that we considered back in the 30 years ago. Almost certainly today, these solutions are likely to need to be in a holistic treatment of nuclear weapons numbers, offensive nuclear weapons numbers, nuclear posture, and missile defense, potentially conventional strike weapons as well. But thank you for your time. I'm happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation, and also thank you for keeping time. Okay, now the next speaker is Dr. Dylan Spaulding, who is a senior scientist of the UCS, and then he's going to talk about the problem with the U.S. plans for plutonium pit production. Dylan, please, floor is yours.
Thank you, and you'll project the slides, is that correct? So thank you for the invitation here. It's been an honor to come, and I'm happy to share this work with you. In this talk, I'm hoping to offer a sort of portrait of the current status of the U.S. national labs, including current plans to reinvigorate plutonium pit production, which is one of the most major projects that the labs have proposed to undertake since the end of the Cold War. And focusing on the U.S. national labs, in part because I think they offer a useful window to understand both the U.S. nuclear posture, but also the challenges that the U.S. faces in achieving its stated goals in that regard. So I'll start with the message that's coming from within the nuclear complex itself. And if you can see the quote at the top, that's saying that our nuclear deterrent is at a crossroads, which I think is true. So far, the U.S. has preserved our nuclear stockpile through a program of science-based stockpile stewardship since the end of the Cold War, meaning that we've extended the life of non-nuclear components in the weapons to give them a longer shelf life, effectively, a longer effective life by about 30 years per life extension. But as far as the Department of Defense, the Pentagon sees it in many, as you can see again in the quote, in many cases we've extended them decades beyond what was originally intended. And the widespread belief in Washington, D.C. now is that these weapons will not remain viable indefinitely. And so there's a huge push now for modernization across all three legs of the nuclear triad. And that includes the infrastructure around weapons production as well as delivery systems. So the U.S. currently has plans to replace nuclear-capable bombers with the B-21 bomber. We're in the process of replacing our ground-based intercontinental ballistic missile system with a new Sentinel missile, which will take over from the Minutemen. We're building new nuclear submarines, and at the same time, now the first proposals for nuclear warheads since the end of the Cold War are coming out. And the labs, the national labs, particularly Sandia, Los Alamos, and Lawrence Livermore in California and New Mexico, I think see this as an opportunity to reinvigorate their role in this whole endeavor. The view from the outside of the nuclear complex, though, is a bit more complex. It's a bit more difficult. As you can see, many of our weapons that are in the currently deployed stockpile have recently been life extended or refurbished. So the stockpile, as it stands, is actually relatively fresh. This upper plot is showing these green bands are showing periods of production for refurbishment, and LPU stands for last production unit, meaning the last one to come out for deployment or reserve. And you can see that these dates are recent. Since 2019, we've seen several of these projects completed. And there are two weapons here that are not shown, which are the W78 and the W87. The W78 was meant to undergo life extension, but that plan was canceled. And the W87 is currently deployed on the Minuteman ICBMs and will likely be redeployed on the new missiles coming up. But again, most of the stockpile is relatively fresh. But we can't necessarily say the same about the infrastructure of the labs themselves. You can see from these pie charts at the bottom that the age of many of the buildings at the labs exceeds 40 years, in some cases even 60 years. And the condition of the infrastructure as determined by NNSA themselves is mostly fair or poor. So there's been an increasing investment in sophisticated scientific facilities, a decreasing emphasis in investment on production kinds of facilities that are now being called for again. So that's a concern for NNSA. And then as you can see in the bottom bar chart, the workforce is also aging. This is as of 2018, but if you can see the ages, you can see the peak is around 56 to 60 years old for employees across the nuclear complex, which means that NNSA is facing an impending wave of retirements of experts and skilled workers in these very specialized positions. And in fact, there remains very few people who are involved in the development of the current stockpile or who are involved in testing. And at two of the major production facilities, Y-12, which is responsible for uranium processing, and Pantex, which does assembly and disassembly in Texas, more than half of the workforce has been there for less than 5 years in these extremely specialized positions. So I'll get to budgets as well coming up, but the NNSA also has an extremely poor track record of bringing large projects to completion, as I'll show in a few slides. So these are many of the challenges that we face regarding modernization across the stockpile. At the same time, the current moment represents a sort of pivot away from the position that the U.S. assumed following the end of the Cold War and the end of full-scale nuclear explosive testing when the U.S. began the program of stockpile stewardship and really turned to a more science-based approach to analyze the health and safety and security of the nuclear stockpile. So we moved increasingly towards doing experiments in what we call high-energy density physics, which is basically moving from underground tests to doing scientific laboratory tests at small scales, but that help us achieve the same pressures and temperatures so that we can better understand weapons performance, aging, and things like that through a combination of experimental research and advanced computational simulations. And that's led to a number of breakthroughs, including the break-even fusion experiment that you may have heard of last year at the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore. It's also resulted in a diversification of the kinds of science that the labs have been able to carry out. But that's also come with a diversification in the kinds of employees. So the many employees across the complex are actually less focused directly on weapons today than they were in the 1980s or shortly at the end of the Cold War. So one of the questions regarding modernization now that's perhaps the most contentious is about the remanufacture of plutonium bomb cores, or pits. And this is the first stage of modern thermonuclear weapons. The pit is the plutonium sphere that's imploded with a shell of surrounding explosives in order to drive the nuclear chain reaction. The U.S. hasn't made plutonium pits in large numbers since 1989 when the Rocky Flats plant in Colorado was closed down. That was the major production facility. It was closed down for extremely serious safety and health violations by the EPA and actually by the FBI. And the U.S. hasn't had the capability to manufacture a large number of pits since then. So the current proposal that NNSA is discussing is building out 2 production lines, one at Los Alamos in what's called the PF4 facility, which is the main plutonium handling facility that currently exists, although it's also aging. The building there is about 45 years old, and it already supports a number of other critical plutonium missions. And secondly, they would build a plutonium pit production line at Savannah River, South Carolina, in what was intended to be a mixed oxide fuel plant at Savannah River, a MOX plant, which you may have heard of. This was a program that was begun and ultimately canceled after about $6 billion was invested in the building you see in this lower right corner, and before it ever entered operation. So it's actually an extremely difficult building to retrofit because it was not built for the purpose of plutonium pit production. It was built for a different nuclear purpose and has extremely thick walls, many small rooms, and is therefore not ideal to be refurbished for this purpose. So again, these facilities are facing difficulties, including the aging of the facility at Los Alamos that I mentioned, the fact that Savannah River was not intentionally built for this purpose. Both face concerns about worker and public safety and security with regard to potential plutonium exposure. Los Alamos, in particular, has had a poor track record of worker safety, including a criticality incident that shut down this facility for 4 years, between 2013 and 2017, when workers placed plutonium rods together to take a picture in a configuration that was not permissible. And then I include the waste isolation pilot plant on this slide, which is not a new facility. This is the waste repository in southern New Mexico, which receives nuclear waste from the national labs. But I include it here because it currently faces permitting issues and potential capacity issues. It was initially meant to close in the 2020s. Its life is now potentially being extended through at least 2080. But there are concerns about whether or not it's sufficient to receive the increased waste stream that would result from plutonium pit production. Finally, there's the question of whether we need new pits at all. Plutonium pits are expected to have a life of at least 85 to 100 years. Most in the current stockpile are only 35 to 40 years old at present, which means they should have quite a long life ahead of them. There's been a significant amount of research expenditure on this topic, as well as outside review, but the labs are currently citing plutonium aging as a result for reinitiating this process. Secondly, we have upwards of 15,000 pits in storage at the Pantex facility in Texas from disassembled weapons that have come out of the stockpile. These are stored in barrels and then put in underground bunkers, as you can see here, and at least several thousand of those should be suitable for reuse. They're of similar age, built in the 1980s, and of designs comparable to some of our most modern weapons currently in the arsenal. One of the other major pivots, though, as I mentioned, is that the U.S. is planning the first new warhead designs to enter the stockpile since the end of the Cold War. And NNSA admits that the first 10 years of new pit production would support manufacture of the W87-1 warhead, which would go on the new ICBM missiles. These are actually closely related to the previously canceled interoperable warheads, what were called IW-1 and IW-2. The other newly proposed warhead is the W93, which would be on submarines. It's not clear yet if the W93 would reuse pits or require newly manufactured pits, but there are reportedly changes to the pit design that preclude reuse of existing pits in the stockpile, and therefore, as NNSA justifies production of new pits. Importantly, I think, with regard to the W93 is that the British are lobbying closely to have this weapon produced, and they're participating closely with the U.S. national labs on its design and implementation. So I want to stress the point that these weapons, although they would be the first new weapons to enter the stockpile, these are not entirely new ideas. Again, the IW-1 and IW-2 concepts date back more than a decade. They predate the more modern developments we see in China. They predate the Ukraine war. They predate many of North Korea's tests. So these ideas are being brought back, but these are actually things the U.S. has been trying to do for quite some time, and these programs have been canceled previously, either due to cost or lack of need. As I mentioned, NNSA has a poor record of bringing projects to completion on time and on schedule. So this plot is showing beginning estimated costs and final costs, and you can see that many of the programs across the complex, including uranium processing facility in Tennessee, several waste management facilities have either tripled their time to completion or tripled their budgets. The Government Accountability Office in Washington, D.C. is a group that keeps track of spending and is kind of a watchdog for DOE programs in particular, has accused the NNSA of not having a comprehensive budget or schedule for pit production, despite it being one of the largest undertakings since the Manhattan Project and potentially the largest investment in the infrastructure since the Manhattan Project. It's expected it may cost upwards of $60 billion by the time it's complete, and more than $24 billion by 2027 alone. And NNSA already acknowledges that they will not meet the statutory requirement for 80 pits per year, which raises questions additionally about the potential deployment of these new warheads if they do require new pits. So finally, I'll close by saying that there are other domestic drivers for nuclear expansion, and I think this is especially important to understand abroad, because I think many of the reports about U.S. modernization and much of the rhetoric from the U.S. nuclear complex is currently driven towards the challenges that we perceive from nuclear peers, in particular China and Russia. However, there is a great deal of competition within the U.S. that encourages these kind of modernization programs. One of them is simply competition between the national labs themselves. We have this structure of 3 national labs who've historically competed for programs, funding, facilities, workforce. And so it's to their benefit to have sort of specialties in each of these areas of modernization. Also, since 2005, the labs have been run by what are called limited liability corporations. Prior to that, Los Alamos and Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore were run by the University of California for no fee. But following 2005, management and operation of the labs was opened up for bidding, and they were taken on by corporations, which include many of the largest defense contractors, such as Northrop Grumman, Battelle, Bechtel, Honeywell. And these are the same companies that hold the contracts to build the submarines, the ICBMs, and many of the delivery systems. So while the management fees they receive to operate the labs are relatively small, a lot of the industrial needs that come along with nuclear modernization also fall to these companies or subsidiaries of these companies. And in addition to that, there's a lot of lobbying by state governments because these modernization programs are seen as extremely strong jobs programs. In Los Alamos alone, the pit production mission is expected to result in around 2,500 new jobs. For a workforce that's currently about 12,000, it will go to more than 14,000, which is a huge expansion for the labs. Same is true at Savannah River, where there's not currently that capability. So it's an extremely attractive option for state legislators to encourage these programs in their states. And you know, most of that investment again is going back to those contractors. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Dylan, thank you very much. So before moving to the next speaker, I just want to remind for the online participant, if you have any question or comment to the speakers, you are very welcome to post it using the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar anytime. Okay, so the next speaker we have is Dr. Sulgiye Park, who is the senior scientist of the UCS. Sulgiye, floor is yours.
Ohayou gozaimasu. It's early morning. Thank you so much for coming. Laura and Dylan talked about United States security issues. I'm going to drive us to Northeast Asia and talk about de facto nuclear weapon state, DPRK, North Korea. Sorry, thank you so much. Okay. It's no secret, North Korea's nuclear activities are ongoing. North Korea's nuclear program is active. North Korea is expanding its nuclear arsenals both quantitatively in terms of numbers and qualitatively in terms of diversity. So last year, 2022, while we were all trying to fight COVID, North Korea fired 70 missiles, right, marking the history in its missile program. It tested 6 nuclear weapons so far, 4 of which happened during the Kim Jong-un's regime, and the 7th one might be pending based on the refurbishing activities at its nuclear test site, Punggye. Now, earlier this year, in about April 2023, North Korea also test-fired its first known use of solid fuel propellants on its long-range projectiles, Hwasong-18, and that markedly increases its counterattack capability. So North Korea remains a continuous threat to Japan, to South Korea, as well as to the United States. So in times when the geopolitical tensions are worsening, we have some questions we want to ask. How many nuclear arsenals does North Korea have? How many more can it make, and how fast can it make? Now, the number of nuclear arsenals are ultimately dependent on the ingredients that are required to make the bombs, the fissile materials. In this case, we're specifically talking about uranium and plutonium. Plutonium is man-made, uranium is not. So how much fissile materials does North Korea have, and what is its production capacity? Now, in the open source literature, North Korea's nuclear warhead estimates ranges anywhere from about 10 to 90. We have a Korean studies that's erring on the higher side, and we have lower side being about 10. Now, compared to nuclear weapon state, 10 is not a big number, but 10 is still 10 more than what North Korea should have. Now, earlier this year, Kim Jong-un made 2 dramatic announcements. He said that South Korea has become their undoubted enemy, while calling for exponential increase in country's nuclear arsenal in 2023. He showcased his KN-25 multiple rocket launchers, also known as the super large multiple rocket launchers. He said that he's going to deploy 30 of them. Each of them carries 6 ballistic missiles. Each ballistic missile carries 1 tactical weapon. So taken literally, that's 180 total nuclear weapons that he wants to deploy. Now, this statement could be an overhyped threat. It could just be a simple response to the intensified military exercises between US and Japan or US and Korea. It could also be his way of distracting his domestic populations as they're trying to recover from COVID-19, as they're trying to recover from natural disasters. Like for those who are not following, 2023 North Korea is experiencing quite high food insecurity. So Kim Jong-un's statement does deserve a little bit of scrutiny. But last year, we did see a nuclear doctrine change in North Korea, right? Last September, North Korea passed a new law that calls for North Korea to preemptively or defensively launch a nuclear attack if its regime's survival is considered threatened. At the same time, it's constantly expanding its warfighting capabilities. It showcased a tactical nuclear weapon in a state newspaper in March of 2023. So Kim Jong-un's statement should not be taken so lightly. Now, to exponentially increase the nuclear arsenals means that you need to drastically increase the output of the weapons materials or fissile materials. Where are the sources of fissile materials in North Korea? So here is a diagram of North Korea's nuclear program. If you have seen nuclear fuel cycle diagram, this does not look that much different from what we know of, right? You always want to start with mining of uranium ore. You chemically and physically process them in the milling facilities, convert them, and you want to enrich them simply because the natural uranium ore does not have the active ingredients of fissile isotope U-235 that generates a lot of energy. If you concentrate them and turn them into fuels, you can use them for light water reactors, which, living in Japan, you probably know that. Now, North Korea also have a graphite moderated reactor. So this takes in unenriched uranium directly, so it's skipping the enrichment part. It generates spent fuel from which North Korea can reprocess weapons-grade materials in the form of plutonium. So that is the first source of fissile materials in North Korea. The other source, of course, is the centrifuge-based enrichment facility. If you enrich to about 3.5%, that's the kind of fuels that you would want to use in the nuclear reactors, such as the light water reactors in Japan. But they can constantly enrich it until it reaches 90% or more uranium-235. That becomes weapons grade. That's what you use to make a weapon. So I want to look more deeply into these two facilities and their capacity to produce fissile materials. These two facilities are located in Yongbyon. That's about 80 kilometers north of North Korea's capital city, Pyongyang. So let's look at the graphite reactor. North Korea started constructing this reactor as early as 1980s, and this is an indigenous reactor. In 1986, it became operational. Interestingly, if you know the history, in 1986 is 1 year after North Korea had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, since it first became critical, there has been a couple of campaigns. By campaigns, I mean the times when North Korea turned the reactor on for plutonium production. The way we count these campaigns are a little bit fluid, meaning that we don't know exactly when they turned it on, how long they were running it for, under what production capacity. But in my analysis, I'm going to count 7 campaigns. And the most recent one started in 2021. It ran for about 2 years, and it supposedly have stopped not too long ago. Now, except for the very early days, by early days I mean the 1990s, since 2000, the way we are monitoring nuclear activities in North Korea is mostly by remote sensing techniques, Earth observations, satellite image analysis. So here I'm showcasing 2 satellite images from 2003 and 2007. We know that during these times, the reactor was operational because we see this effluent coming out of this cooling tower. Pretty straightforward. You see a steam coming out, the reactor might be operational, North Korea might be making plutonium. But what happened in 2008? They blew off the cooling tower, right? To show the commitment to the international deal, North Korea blew off its cooling tower. It was a pretty powerful movement. It was a pretty symbolic movement to show that North Korea was willing to take a step towards denuclearization in exchange for concessions. Concessions could be lifting of sanctions, financial aid, or political recognition. Now, it was a pretty bold move, but experts did warn that the process is not irreversible, right? This is not going to ultimately freeze the operations of nuclear programs in North Korea. Now, what they feared was that they could just simply direct the water directly into river, discharge it directly into river, instead of having to flow through the cooling tower. Well, that's exactly what we observed today. Whoops. So today, the way we confirm the operational status of nuclear reactor in North Korea is by looking at the water being discharged directly into the river, as well as the effluent or steam from the turbine generator. So how much plutonium has been produced from this reactor? Now here's a graph of cumulative weapons-grade plutonium as a function of years. So by looking at remote sensing analysis, by looking at the technical details of this reactor, we could understand how much plutonium they have separated using just this one facility. So I'm showing separated plutonium in kilograms on the y-axis as a function of year. These two lines indicate high-end and low-end based on several assumptions. So as of today, October 2023, not counting plutonium from the most recent campaign, my estimate is about 63 to 82 kilograms of plutonium that North Korea produced using this 5 megawatts reactor. But North Korea tested 6 nuclear weapons to date, from which it probably used about 20 kilograms of plutonium, so the remaining balance is 44 to 63 kilograms, and that's enough to make about 9 to 12 fission-type weapons, about 4 to 6 kilograms per weapon. So that's 5 megawatt graphite reactor. If I simply project it out to 2030, assuming an optimal and normal operating conditions, that's approximately 83 to 112 kilograms, enough to make 17 to 22 weapons by 2030. Now the enrichment program. The enrichment program's history is a little bit shorter than that of the 5 megawatt reactor. Like, we didn't know about it until 2010. It was first revealed to the outsiders when Stanford delegate visited the site on November of 2010, and inside this blue roof building, he observed a very modern, small industrial scale facilities with about 2,000 centrifuges. Now, North Korea strictly denied all the work on enrichment facility up until 2010, but when he visited the site, the scale and the sophisticatedness of this facility suggested that they must have done some work dating back a few years. We estimate that year to be about 2005. Now, since 2010, no one was able to visit the site to confirm. I'm going to fast forward to 2013. North Korea expanded this enrichment cascade hall. We don't exactly know what's inside, but for lack of anything better, we're going to assume that they expanded its centrifuge facility and added 2,000 more centrifuges. Now, the number of centrifuges basically tell you how much enriched materials they can make in a certain amount of time. Now, adding to that uncertainty is the possibility that they have a secret covert clandestine facility outside of Yangbyon. We don't know the location, we don't know the operational status, we don't know how many centrifuges there are, but again, for the lack of anything better, we're going to assume that this covert facility exists with approximately comparable capacity. So 8,000 centrifuges total. Certainly possible that North Korea is dedicating all of them to make high-enriched uranium or weapons-grade uranium, but North Korea also has ambitions to make nuclear energy. So it is possible that North Korea designed its enrichment capacity to produce both low-enriched uranium for energy production as well as high-enriched uranium for military needs. I'm going to entertain the possibility. If you assume that 4,000 centrifuges are used to make weapons-grade uranium, that's about 1,200 kilograms of HEU, or high-enriched uranium, that North Korea could have made. And 4,000 centrifuges is also enough to make 47 metric tons of low-enriched uranium. 1,200 kilograms of high-enriched uranium is enough to make 60 first-generation type bombs. 47 metric tons of low-enriched uranium is enough to run 11 cycles of light water reactor that North Korea attempted to build. Again, simple projections out to 2030, that's about 1,800 kilograms of HEU by 2030, enough to make 90 bombs and 74 metric tons of low-enriched uranium. Okay, so I just showed you the number of fissile materials, amount of fissile materials that this 5 megawatt graphite reactor as well as enrichment facility can produce. So now, if you think, if one day you wake up and Kim Jong-un said, hey, here's the deal. You can get rid of one of those boxes. What would you get rid of if you are to restrain North Korea's nuclear arsenal production? You could get rid of one box. Professor Suzuki, which box would you choose? Reprocessing. That's a great answer. Reprocessing would definitely slow down North Korea's plutonium production. But they still have enrichment facility, and North Korea built reprocessing facility on its own with the help of Pakistani most likely, which means that they could just do it again. Ultimately, all of this points to the very front end of the nuclear fuel cycle mining, right? So if sanctions are working if it's true that no country is providing North Korea with plutonium or uranium, the mining of its own domestic uranium resources is the first, and it could be the most rate-limiting steps in the productions of nuclear arsenals. So let's dive into that a little bit. There's only one confirmed uranium mining milling facility in North Korea, and that's Pyeongsan Uranium Mining Mill. If you look at the map, that's actually not too far away from South Korea. I'm going to look at this from the geological perspective. You don't often hear people talking about geology in the study of peace, study of nuclear disarmament. But when it comes to the front end of the nuclear fuel cycle, geology plays a very important role. It is what tells you what's underground, where is it under the ground, what is it under the ground, how do you take it out under the ground, how do you process it. So in times when we cannot access North Korea, geology offers one of the solid evidence-based analysis on what could be underground. In this case, what kind of uranium do they have? So I'm collecting a lot of geological maps of North Korea. I'm looking at some of the reports that Japanese geologists collected in North Korea, Soviet Union geologists collected in North Korea, combining that with primary documents from International Atomic Energy Agency, or even CIA used to go to North Korea, so some of the documents from CIA. Now this is a geological map. It's very colorful, it's very pretty, but for those who are not familiar with those maps, each of those color blocks represent a very specific types of rocks, their ages and their geochemistry. Okay, so I promise this is the most technical slide that I have today. So if you look at Pyeongsan uranium mine from a geological perspective, it is located in a deposit that's composed of metasedimentary rocks dating back to Mesoproterozoic eon. That's a lot of geologic jargon. All that is, it's pretty compact. It's a little bit old, about 480 to 1600 million years old rocks. So just a little bit old. Now the literature does indicate uranium minerals in the form of coffinite or uraninite. These are just different types of uranium-bearing minerals. And they do indicate that these uranium minerals in North Korea are correlated with certain trace elements of sulfide minerals. So that's just the definitions of some geochemical environments. Now in the perfect world, I will visit North Korea myself, collect those rocks, and try to constrain the ore quality and quantity. I'm a South Korean, so if I tried to do that, I would not be alive. So I'm going to turn to another place that has a similar depositional environments. What are other places that we can look to that has similar depositional geochemistry that we can refer as proxy? Now, fortunately, the place is not too far away. The place exists across the political boundary in South Korea in a place called the Okcheon Metamorphic Belt. Similar to the deposit in Pyeongsan, it's composed of similar kinds of rocks, similar kinds of ages, similar kinds of uranium minerals, but there we know the uranium concentration as well as uranium quantity. Right, so despite the political boundary, there are some geologic similarities across these two places. So based on the comparable geological settings and ages and mineralogical details, it seems like the Pyeongsan uranium deposit in North Korea shares comparable deposition environments, and the deposit type is most likely metamorphosed organic shale. Now, all that is to say, the average uranium ore grade in North Korea seems to be very low, in the range of 0.01 to 0.03 weight percent. That is low. Like, to have an economical value, you want uranium ore grade 0.1% or more. Like, Japan probably knows that. You don't have a lot of uranium, so you're importing a lot of uranium from Australia, Kazakhstan, Canada. North Korea cannot do that. So how far can it go when the average ore grade is so low? Now, that's about 2 orders of magnitude lower than what have been reported in the media. So I'm just going to point to a little bit of peer-reviewed papers that corroborates our analysis. And the Soviet Union geologists in the 1990s collected some rocks. They analyzed the concentrations, and the concentrations are quite low, as you can see, about 20 parts per million to 300 parts per million. Also looked at geological uranium deposits across the world that has similar depositional environments, and again, to be pretty low ore grades, adhering to our geological analysis in North Korea. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide. So why do I care about the ore quality? Sorry, I'll be really quick. Because it really defines how much uranium you have to mine in order to make certain weapons, right? So if you assume that North Korea has 900 kilograms of high-energy uranium and 48 kilograms of plutonium, it needs to mine about 66,000 tons of ore if the ore grade is as high as 1%. Now that number increases to 2.2 million when the ore grade decreases to 0.03%. Right? So that question really leads us to say, well, does North Korea have 2.2 million of uranium ore if its ore grade is so low? Sorry, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip these slides. But it could mean that North Korea could be looking at other places to mine uranium, so we need to keep an eye out on which uranium mines they're mining. And I'm going to jump to the conclusion. North Korea's nuclear weapons program remains constantly active. It's expanding its nuclear arsenals diversity-wise and quantity-wise. Now we're trying to holistically understand how many arsenals North Korea can make by looking at each step of nuclear fuel pathway, but still there remains huge, and I'm going to emphasize, huge uncertainties when it comes to predicting North Korea's fissile material stocks and production capacity. Despite that it's not easy to understand the fissile material stocks and production capacity or predict it, I'm going to say that we still need to continue and try because it has policy implications, like the negotiation processes, the non-proliferation commitment, how do we decommission the light water reactor if it starts operating from the safeguards perspective. Now, all of those questions need to be considered all the while we try to engage North Korea continuously. So I'm going to pose a really big question here, and I'm going to end my talk here. Thank you, Keiko.
Thank you, Sulgiye. I know 15 minutes is too short. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so our next speaker is Mr. Robert Rust. He's a China analyst of the UCS.
Thanks. Hello. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here so early in the morning or on Sunday night, I guess, if you're on the East Coast of the United States. Following up my colleagues' very interesting and very deep technical perspectives, I'm going to talk a little bit more from a social science perspective. Since joining UCS earlier this year, a lot of the work that we've done has been on analyzing Chinese nuclear weapons buildup, Chinese nuclear weapons politics, Chinese politics in general, but increasingly, a big chunk of the work has focused on US-China relations in general, because US-China relations are deteriorating. They're deteriorating, or they have deteriorated rapidly, and the title of this talk, the topic, is the potential for US-China nuclear conflict. And a big part of that, a big baseline for that, is what are the relations like between the two countries in non-security domains, in my opinion. And if those things get worse, then the likelihood of conflict goes up. There's been a lot of talk about new Cold War, this idea that China and the United States are in a new Cold War now. And despite some policies from both sides and some happenings on both sides suggesting that that might be the case, and it might be the case in the future, I would argue that it's not, because of the very close economic ties between the United States and China. I think that using the frame of the Cold War to look at that relationship is counterproductive. When we were in Tokyo having our discussions with some of our colleagues from China, Korea, and Japan, before coming down here, a term that came up that I thought was very useful is the idea of mutually assured economic destruction, when it comes to the two countries being so closely tied economically, and the recent efforts that the United States has taken to decouple or de-risk from the Chinese economy and try to prevent China from acquiring technology that it deems sensitive or that it deems could have military applications. I think this is a useful frame for understanding the relationship, because if, for both sides, if there was a comprehensive economic decoupling, it would be pretty rough and pretty disastrous. And the last year saw a record high in US-China trade, so a comprehensive decoupling is not happening to begin with. So I think that when we think about the US-China relationship, I think this is important to keep in mind as sort of a, I guess, a baseline, sort of bulwark for the relationship. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk a little bit about China's nuclear buildup over the last few years. So one of the main events that's been talked about internationally when it comes to China's nuclear program is the discovery of 3 large silo fields rather, in distant inland areas in China. So one of the fields is in Yumen in Gansu province, one is in Hami in Xinjiang, and one is close to Ordos in the province of Inner Mongolia. And once the silo fields are completely finished, they will comprise approximately 300 silos. There are also a small amount of silos potentially being built at existing nuclear weapon sites, but not enough to really impact the number significantly. And so the question then is, what does this say about China's number of warheads, China's nuclear arsenal? So the Pentagon estimates that China has already exceeded 400 warheads by 2022, and that it will continue to grow to 1,000 in 2030 and 1,500 by 2035. So I would just like to point out that these estimates, we cannot be entirely sure of this. The Pentagon cannot be entirely sure of this, or rather, if they are, they can't really. I don't think that they would be able to tell us exactly why they know. But they have been wrong before about estimates like this, and the growth rate simply assumes a continued rise along the same lines, and it also assumes certain things about what the silo fields are going to look like when they're finished. So it assumes that all of the silos are going to be filled, that there are not going to be any decoys, and that the missiles placed in those silos are going to be fitted with 3 warheads each. So then the question is, why is China doing this? Why are they choosing to undertake this significant nuclear buildup when historically China has always maintained that the only reason that they have nuclear weapons is because other people have nuclear weapons in order to maintain a minimum deterrent? So there are a few reasons why. Mainly, I would say that the main reason is to decrease vulnerability to other countries, and specifically the United States. So I'll touch on this a little bit later, but the United States has consistently refused to acknowledge vulnerability to China's nuclear arsenal. And China has become increasingly nervous about US conventional capabilities. China does not believe that the United States would launch or is likely to launch a first strike against China, despite the fact that the United States has never been willing to take a first strike off the table. They don't have a no first use policy like China does. But they're concerned about growing United States conventional weapons capabilities, and whether or not they would be able to use increasing advances in conventional weapons capabilities to disable the Chinese nuclear arsenal with conventional weapons. There's questions about how likely this is with current U.S. capabilities. Some have said that it's unlikely that they would be able to target China's silos and put them all out of commission, but other analysts have said that it would be possible with sort of advances in the accuracy and power of those kinds of weapons. So in any rate, China's nervous about that. Another potential reason, which I don't think is particularly significant, is the idea of prestige. That China is growing, China's getting stronger, China's becoming a superpower in some senses, and so that they simply think that they need a bigger arsenal, a stronger arsenal, to be able to project that power increasingly. Like I said, I don't really find that very persuasive, because I think that the Chinese nuclear weapons doctrine and the position that the nuclear weapons hold in China's military strategy is still the same. And I think that they have no interest in growing their arsenal dramatically in an attempt to get close to the United States or Russia's size. And so I think that the vulnerability argument is much more persuasive, because I think that the desire to eliminate that vulnerability is sort of the main driver there. Another couple of reasons is the idea that, or the fact that the silos allow China to transition to more solid fuel missiles than their current liquid fuel missiles. Liquid fuel missiles take longer to fuel up. They are more dangerous, more complicated to fuel up, and solid fuel missiles will be quicker, ready quicker if they were to be ever to be needed. Another side of that is that currently China's arsenal is mostly made up of road mobile ICBMs, where the warheads are kept separate from the launchers, and they're mated or paired and prepared if there was ever going to be a nuclear threat situation. And so naturally that makes them a little bit more at risk. If an adversary was able to figure out that they were being put together, they could be able to target them more easily. And so sort of balancing out their arsenal and adding more silos to the arsenal makes that, it lowers that risk essentially. So these are all possibilities. But there's also the question of fissile materials. And this is something that analysts have been trying to figure out for a long time. How much plutonium does China have? How much fissile material does China have? How many bombs could they make with the material that they have? And so the estimate made by scholar researcher Jiang Hui in 2017 suggests that China would have enough plutonium for over 1,000 warheads. Like I said, that estimate was made in 2017, and the Pentagon's increase of its estimate of China's arsenal size to over 400 weapons through the end of 2021, coupled with the Pentagon's argument that they are going to increase to 1,500 by 2035, suggests that China's already cut into the plutonium that they had, and that they'll have to get more from another source. China has not made or has not run its own weapons-grade plutonium processing facilities since the late 1980s. And there's no evidence that suggests that they've restarted that process. But, and this is a central part of the Pentagon's argument, they have been building 2 demonstration fast breeder reactors in Fujian, on the coast of Fujian. And the Pentagon argues that the plutonium that will result from these closed fuel cycle fast breeder reactors is going to be the plutonium that China is intending to use to maintain this buildup. There's a lot of questions about this. My colleague, Dr. Park, is researching this. I'm assisting her with that, essentially because there's a question of whether or not that's worth their time, or not worth their time, but whether or not it makes sense for China to do that and not just restart its weapons-grade plutonium production capabilities, which it is allowed to do as a nuclear weapon state. And Chinese sources that we've looked at make it clear that the fast breeders are very experimental, and there's a lot of questions, a lot of issues, a lot of setbacks through the process. We're waiting for the first fast breeder to come online this year, so we'll see whether or not that happens on schedule. But essentially, if China is committed to reaching the warhead numbers that the Pentagon says it is committed to, then there's a question of whether or not it would be willing to rely on the plutonium coming from the fast breeders, because there are these questions that persist around it. So I'm going to try to go through this a little quicker than I had intended, but just to talk a little bit about political developments. So Xi Jinping has put significant focus on modernizing the PLA in recent years. The 19th Party Congress Work Report in 2017 called for a focus on improving combat readiness. The specific goal being improving mechanization, informatization, that is information warfare, and intelligentization, meaning artificial intelligence, sort of new fields like that. And there was also a stated goal of achieving a significant structural modernization by 2035, and the overall goal being a complete overhaul of combat readiness by 2049. Obviously a very significant year for the PRC. However, in 2022, after the 20th Party Congress Work Report came out, there was a new phase of sort of language used to talk about this from China's side. Specifically focused a lot on strengthening deterrence, building a strong deterrent system. This is language that hadn't been used in previous work reports, and really had not previously been used very much through official channels at all. So the question is, what does this mean? Most Chinese analysts that I've seen took it to mean the focus of building a more sort of resilient nuclear weapons deterrent. While a lot of others have focused on the fact that they want to use emerging fields like artificial intelligence, build deterrence through those fields as well. Specifically the PLA, a lot of PLA sources have mentioned that. So, And then there's also the recent People's Liberation Army Rocket Force shakeup. The Rocket Force is responsible for China's missiles, nuclear and conventional. Recently, the commander, his deputy, and the previous number 2 were all removed and replaced by outsiders that had not previously been involved with the Rocket Force, which led a lot of people to speculate what this meant. Did it have any meanings for essentially what the Rocket Force's role is going to be within the PLA going forward? And most recently in September, the PLA announced that there had been shortcomings during a Rocket Force exercise. And so for them to mention this, they didn't specify whether it was nuclear or conventional, but for them to go out and specify this suggests that the Rocket Force is a significant target of those modernizations and reforms that Xi Jinping had announced. So a significant question is whether or not China actually believes that the United States would use nuclear weapons first. If they're not deterred from using conventional means by nuclear threats in a potential conflict, what would the United States do if they are losing? And where would those forces come from? Where would they be launched from? What would the target be? These are the questions that kind of lead to insecurity around this issue. And so an increasing question in recent years has been the question of whether or not the United States will redeploy nuclear weapons to South Korea or Japan. Now, when South Korean President Yoon suggested that this could be a possibility publicly, we saw President Biden make a very clear, very definite public no, saying absolutely not, no chance. But when it comes to Japan, there is a much more complicated history with this. There's more. The nuclear taboo is stronger. There were not openly deployed nuclear weapons in Japan, although we found out in retrospect after the weapons were taken out of Okinawa that they were there during the Cold War. And so a few things. The question is, if Japan is drawn into US-China conflict, will nuclear weapons be involved? And what does that imply for Japan? Nixon's agreement in 1972 that they could return return weapons to Okinawa in an emergency begs the question of whether or not this sort of under-the-table agreement might be brought up in the future. Around 2009, the current National Security Advisor Akiba was in D.C. At the talking to the Perry-Schlesinger Commission. And some of his comments that he made around that time suggested that he felt that Japan needed a NATO-like system of deterrence of nuclear sharing. So the question is whether or not there are forces in Japan pushing for redeployment. I would very much like to hear what our audience and people have to say about that. From a personal level, I was at a talk hosted by the Asia Society in New York this spring, where a previous deputy national security advisor in Japan, Nobukatsu Kanehara, mentioned that he would like to see, and he was implying, I think, that a lot of other people in important positions would like to see U.S. nuclear subs have greater access to Japanese ports and have a greater role in the extended deterrence that the United States provides to Japan. So I think I'm running low on time, but I would like to end by emphasizing the importance of narratives between in the U.S.-China relationship, and the narrative that many are pushing in the United States, and something that we want to push back against, is the idea that China is inherently our competitor. China doesn't see great power competition as the correct way to look at our current moment. They see that as counterproductive. They see that as something that will only end in conflict, whereas the United States thinks that competition is something that two great powers or two large states can pursue without necessarily ending in conflict. And I think that it's important for us, the work that we do, is pushing back on the idea that that great power competition is a fact of life and here to stay, because it makes all of us more insecure when the United States and China are on insecure footing. Beijing believes that that situation will end with one destroying the other. And I think that the fact that they believe that suggests that we need to push back on that narrative. So, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. So our next and the last speaker will be Ms. Eryn MacDonald. She's an analyst of the UCS, and she's going to talk about the U.S. nuclear and the military budget. Eryn, floor is yours.
Sorry. Hi, thank you so much again. I apologize for the confusion. Is it okay now? Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting us here. It's an honor to be here. I will try to do this old school with no slides. So I apologize for not being able to show you some of the figures and things that I had in mind. But I am going to talk today about the US nuclear weapons budget, which kind of encompasses some of the things that my colleagues here have already talked about and have touched on. So just to begin with, I was going to show you, but I can just tell you about the US nuclear budget, excuse me, the US military budget in general is obviously enormous. It is by far the largest in the world, larger than the next 9 countries combined, which include many of our allies. So it's not like we're in competition with these countries. Just keep track of time. And out of this huge military budget that the US has, the nuclear weapons component is actually a relatively small percentage, but that is still billions and billions of dollars. So it's not, even though it's not the largest component, it is still extremely significant. And I wanted to start by just talking about like what actually is the US nuclear weapons budget, because it's not something that's actually collected in one place very clearly. So people who have worked on this have spent a lot of time going through and picking out pieces of programs from here and there in different budgets and trying to put this together. And there's also questions about what should be included, what should not be included, how do you count things that are used for both nuclear purposes and conventional purposes. But the 2 main components are the Department of Defense, which covers delivery vehicles, the missiles, the bombers, the subs that deliver these weapons, and also all the operations, and command and control, that kind of thing. And then the other component is more of what Dylan was talking about before, which is the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is a semi-autonomous agency under the Department of Energy. And that is the side where they deal with all of the warheads and the bombs. So that is the part that builds these things, researches, designs new types of warheads, or tries to do stockpiled stewardship to make sure that older warheads are still viable. And so those are, when you put those 2 together, you get the overall budget. And so in the last year, on the Department of Defense side, excuse me, this is FY23, the US spent about $34 billion, and on the NNSA side, about $16.5 billion. So a total of about $51 billion altogether. And that includes all of the programs that are in various stages to develop new pit production capacities, for example, to look at the existing warheads and verify that they're still usable, and also developing. Right now, the U.S. is modernizing every component of its nuclear force. So we are in the process of revamping everything from submarines and bombers and building new ICBMs. So that covers all of those things. So there are various estimates as to how much this will all cost in the long run, and those estimates change frequently, and usually, not usually, always they go up. So a few years ago, people were talking about we were going to spend $1 trillion on modernizing the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years, and that number has now risen to almost $2 trillion. And that's before getting into this new report that Laura mentioned, that is basically calling for even more than that. So this is a lot of money, obviously. And one of the things that happens in all of these programs, in the NNSA and DoD, is that the costs continue to rise and rise. Both are notorious for being over budget, over time, and not completing things the way that they're supposed to. There was a GAO report, General Accounting Office, Government Accounting Office report about the NNSA back in March of this year that found that the NNSA's major projects collectively exceeded their cost estimates by over $2 billion and surpassed collective schedules by almost 10 years. So some of these things, like Dylan was talking about at the Savannah River site, they actually began building a facility, spent about $8 billion, and then decided, we're not going to do this anymore. We're just going to end this project. And now we're going to try to retrofit it and make it into something else where we'll be able to build plutonium pits. It was originally supposed to be mixed oxide fuel for nuclear reactors. So we've lost that money. We are now finding a way to lose even more money on doing this because the plutonium pit project is not going well either. And as Dylan has mentioned, it's not clear that it needs to be going as well as they would like it to. But I wanted to kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about the process of how all of this happens, because it's fairly complicated. And I think this is one of the reasons that, well, part of the reason that you see so many strange things happening sometimes in the budget in the US, where you get things that nobody really wanted, or one person wanted and everybody else was like, no, thank you. But basically, we have this very convoluted process where the military branches all kind of make their wish lists, write down everything that they would ever want, put it in a list, send it off to somebody, and then they eventually winnow it down to something a little bit more reasonable and send that to the president, who the administration comes up with a budget, which then goes to Congress. And this is supposed to happen sort of in early February of each year. And then we have the House and Senate. I don't know if you've heard much about American government these days, but it is not super functional. They don't always get along very well. And so there are lots of opportunities for things to happen here. It is not easy to get through these things sometimes. So on the one hand, there's the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, and they're the ones that prepare this National Defense Authorization Act. This is where you authorize, say, you're allowed to spend the money on this thing. Excuse me, but even once things are authorized, there's then this other set of committees called the Appropriations Committees. These are the ones who actually say this amount of money is allotted to this, right? So they appropriate the money for things. And these are separate processes. So something that's in the authorization bill may not end up in the appropriations bill. Something that's not in the authorization bill may end up in the appropriations bill. And in the course of this whole process, there are subcommittees involved. There are, chair people of these subcommittees who have power to make it easier or harder to get these things through. So what I'm basically trying to say is that there are a lot of influences going on here. And this is only talking about the internal influences inside Congress. And then, sorry, I don't have the slide, but from the outside, one of the things that Dylan also mentioned is that there are, the military contractors, for instance, who have lobbyists who are going to Congress and saying, we want this, we don't want that, and spending lots and lots of money doing this. There are also constituents who have perhaps some influence, we like to think. There are outside experts. There are, donors to various politicians who are all kind of putting their words in about what they want to see. So the process gets even more complicated. There's all kinds of influences going on here, and it's not a sort of cut and dried thing. And so this is where you end up with, we get to October and we're supposed to have completed something because that's when the fiscal year ends. So if you don't pass it by then, you have to do something called a continuing resolution, which allows the government to operate for a little bit longer until you can figure this thing out. And if you can't do that, then you shut down the government, because why not? And so in the last 10 years, I think there have been 47 continuing resolutions because we never get this done on time anymore. And 3 government shutdowns of various lengths, some very short. So again, this whole process is very complicated and it's open to a lot of different influences. And it ends up with kind of crazy outcomes sometimes. And I did have a slide here that shows you just sort of how much money some of these big defense contractors are putting into this. But trust me, it is a lot. And you'll recognize all the names on this list: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, the ones who are benefiting from these things as well, right? Who are the ones designing these systems and building them. And I think possibly very much for that reason, the budget just keeps going up and up and up. This is true whether you have, a Democrat in the White House, a Republican in the White House, the trend is still upward. And when Joe Biden came into office, he talked about not wanting to do some of these nuclear weapon systems that he thought were not useful, were dangerous, and yet his first budget was an increase over the Trump administration's budget, and his last budget also has been. So there actually hasn't been a lot of progress in that way, I guess. Excuse me. Sorry, I've gone through this rather quickly. I apologize if it's too fast, but I just wanted to sort of take a step from there and say, so we know that the budget process is kind of broken. The agencies that are carrying out these programs don't do a great job of it. And yet we keep throwing more and more money at things and thinking it will get us somewhere. So where are we going from here? And I think, unfortunately, nowhere good. Probably not news to anybody. But what are some of the things that might affect what we do in the future as far as looking toward the budget? One thing is this report that Laura mentioned that just came out this week, which is a strategic posture review that was done by a commission. And basically, there's a quote that they say that the nuclear force modernization program of record is absolutely essential, although not sufficient. So their take is that, we have now 2 peer competitors we have to deal with, not just Russia, but also China. And in order to do that, what we're doing now is not sufficient. So this modernization program that we've had in place for the last 10 or so years, that we're already behind on and over budget on, now we need to do more than that. How that happens, they're not really clear. They say we haven't studied the economics of this. They say The Commission is sensitive to budget concerns, but required adjustments to U.S. strategic posture are necessary and should be prioritized. The Commission is concerned that artificial congressional caps placed on spending for national security will undermine the actions the Commission recommends. So basically, give me more money, right? And that's their bottom line. We need to do this, and we're going to have to find a way to do it. And the fact that we haven't been able to carry out the plan that we already have does not seem to factor in here for them. And another factor that's coming up that will also affect in the same way is the looming expiration of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the New START Treaty, which is due to expire in 2026 in February, which now constrains the US and Russia to deploying 1,550 warheads each, weapons each. And looking around at the world today, you can see obviously there is not much hope that there's going to be a new treaty in place after that. So the next question is, then what? And obviously all of these things are kind of leading in the same direction, which is to say we need more weapons, more money, more delivery systems, more everything. And the US modernization program that we have in place now, as kind of overdone as I think a lot of us believe it is, was premised on the idea that things would kind of continue along the same course with Russia, that we would have a relatively decent relationship that would be able to continue either limiting or reducing the number of weapons that we each had in our arsenals. And that clearly is not what people are thinking anymore. So where do we go from here? I don't have a lot of encouraging things to say, I'm afraid, and I hate to end on that note, but I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eryn. So now we'd like to take, although we are a little bit behind the schedule, but we'd like to. Are you sure? Okay. So yeah, is it okay? Or we take a 2 minutes break because there is no question yet has come from the online. Should we wait for that? 5 minutes. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's try to secure the question time. But yeah, let's take a 5 minutes break. Now with my watch, it's 10:35. So let's take a break until 10:40. Okay, please come back, and then we're going to start 10:40 on sharp. So meanwhile, for the participant and the online participant, please put your question and a comment so that we can read during the break time. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Okay, thank you very much. Welcome back. So now we'd like to resume. So sorry, before we start, I'm sorry about the difficulties, about the PowerPoint slide. So after this session, RECNA would like to put ours, whenever we're ready, we'd like to put our, the video on our website, and also as well as the PowerPoint slide from the presenter, so that everyone can share later on. So thank you very much. So now we would like to move to the session for the free discussion. So Tatsu Suzuki from the RECNA will take a lead. He's going to serve as the moderator. So I'm going to hand the microphone to Tatsu.
Hi, this is Tatsu Suzuki. Thank you very much. The presentation all rich and very wide variety of topics, so maybe difficult to focus on the subject, but there are already 3 questions online, and I will take some of those. We cannot call them to come up with a voice, right? The speakers? No, on the screen. No, okay. I have to read it. Okay. For missile defense. Okay, I read the questions. I'm deeply troubled that boost phase missile defense is even considered not only by missile defense proponents, but also critics, such as Fissile. Is it even possible to tell an ICBM's intended target during the boost phase? If not, wouldn't the boost phase defense simply run the risk of being an offensive strike? Laura, can you? Can you read it? J.J. Su's questions.
Is it possible to tell? Yes, yes, thank you, sorry, my apologies. Is it possible to tell the target during the boost phase? Yes, in general, maybe not precisely to the city, but you certainly can tell whether it's headed towards the United States. You could tell whether it's headed towards the east or west coast of the United States. So you could distinguish them from space launch vehicles, but it does. The longer you wait, the better information you have, and the longer you wait, sometimes the more challenging it is to mount a defense. So what I understand from the question asker is they're dismayed that we're considering such a thing. Wouldn't boost phase simply be considered a strike? So there is a concern that it might be mistaken for a space launch vehicle. I guess another concern of sort of the boost phase defenses that would be possibly mounted from drones around North Korea is if what such a defense would be doing is targeting the missile as it's launching, and really most of that trajectory during its launch would be over China. So that defense would be shooting into space over China, which of course does present some possibilities of misperception and miscalculation. You'd really need to take really great care that you understood where the missile was going, and that that one doesn't run the risk of China misinterpreting what was happening. So I understand your concerns.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions to Mr. Last for China. Okay, one is, let me see. You have mentioned that China is not likely interested in achieving prestige, and rather their build-up is for decreasing vulnerability. What's your interpretation of Chinese stance that they would not engage in arms control dialogue, bilaterally with the United States, as they have been making their posture visible, that those dialogues are too soon? That's the first question for.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
That is a very good question. I think when it comes to China's willingness to engage in arms control, I think a big part of the history of that is that they want that to happen through multilateral channels. For example, I think a big part of, and Gregory can maybe elaborate on that a little bit too, but I think a big part of the disappointment that China has had with the U.S. on arms control in the past is, for example, the United States not ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which I think is just to them representative of the lack of willingness to engage. So I think my interpretation of that is that I think that China wants those kinds of treaties and wants those kinds of multilateral settings to be where these things happen and where these things are decided. We've seen that lately on more of like a bigger scale with their new foreign relations law, which sort of codifies the multilateral organizations and multilateral fora as the place where they want all of these kinds of things to happen. They want a robust multilateral system where people can engage. And I think they feel that engaging in arms control dialogue bilaterally, often a problem between the US and China in those kinds of settings is that the United States wants to go in with specific detailed issues that they want to hammer out, and then the general relationship or the general sort of baseline, the basis can be figured out later. But China sees things the opposite way. They want the baseline relationship to be stable, which I think you can see sometimes with Chinese reactions to the United States, for example, saying that we want to cooperate more, we want to, improve relations, and then the next day, President Biden goes and says something very incendiary, right, inflammatory about Xi Jinping or about China or about something like that in general. They can't understand that. They don't understand the sort of how they can say one thing and then turn around and say something that seems completely different. Whereas to the United States, I think that you can have the sniping and the posturing at the same time as you kind of fix specific questions more detailed. I hope that is yeah. Thank you.
One more question about Taiwan factor. How do you take Taiwan factor into your analysis?
Right. So Taiwan, I think any U.S.-China conflict, Taiwan will be the flashpoint. And I think a big part of China's doing a lot of aggressive things in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. But I think I understand most of those as reactions to American actions, to U.S. actions. And I think you can see that in multiple situations. I think you can see that in the nuclear buildup. That's a reaction to a U.S. Sort of consistent reactions to what I was talking about, vulnerability to the United States force and trying to beef that up a little bit. Of course, we're not happy about that, but it does seem like a reaction to that stance from the U.S. side. When it comes to Navy operations or military exercises, as one of our colleagues pointed out in Tokyo, I mean, you bring all these Navy ships, you bring all these gunboats and do a bunch of military exercises in my backyard, how can I not react? Which I think that's the way they see that. And I think when it comes to Taiwan specifically, a lot of the political visits that the United States has had, for example, Nancy Pelosi's visit last year, obviously sparked tension significantly. I think the United States needs to be more, I guess, careful about how it approaches that issue, because we have agreed with China, right, on the status of Taiwan. We've agreed to the One China policy. And I think that when things like that happen, this is another example of differences, right? Nancy Pelosi can go to Taiwan independent of like a top level decision, whereas in China that would never happen. So I think there's like a misunderstanding of how can you do that? How can you do that and say one thing and then do another? And just lastly, to touch on Taiwan, we just the other day, Taiwan does an opinion poll every year on what the people think should be the future trajectory of relations with the mainland. And it's, the choices are independence immediately, reunification immediately, or status quo forever, status quo with a view towards independence in the future, status quo with a view towards reunification in the future. And this year was the first time that status quo forever is a higher percentage than status quo with a view towards independence in the future. And status quo overall, those three choices almost make up 90%, right? Which is just to say that in the sort of US-China sniping over Taiwan, a big thing that gets forgotten is the people that actually live on Taiwan. Their preference is for stability, their preference is for peace, obviously. And I think both sides, the United States and China, should take the people that would be hurt on the ground from a war more into account. But yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer, so I'm going to pass it on to somebody else. But I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. I have one question for probably all of you regarding the Japan-U.S. extended deterrence dialogue. And of course, U.S. nuclear weapons should cover Chinese and North Korean threats, but is there any specific discussion regarding this Japan-U.S. dialogue about this Chinese or North Korean nuclear threats? Is there anybody who can talk to?
I'm going to read it again. This one? No, I honestly don't think I could give a very good answer to this question, to be perfectly honest. But the Japanese government certainly does expect U.S. nuclear weapons to cover Chinese, North Korean, and Russian. But I think that increasingly maybe not even increasingly, I think that the bulk of that is focused on covering the threat from China. And I think that maybe, yeah, I think the bulk of that is definitely focused on China. And I think that when the Japanese side pushes the United States for better guarantees or discusses sort of weapons systems and things like that with them, I think that is with a view towards China, much more so than North Korea, and certainly much more than Russia. But I don't really have a very detailed knowledge of the discussions on the EDD.
Yeah, I'd be happy to supplement just a little bit. I'm Gregory Kalaki, the China project manager at UCS. These dialogues were a creation of these Perry Schlesinger Commission discussions in 2009. And it sort of elevated the dialogue between the United States over and Japan over nuclear weapons issues. And the memo that Robert was talking about lists a whole lot of demands that the Chinese Foreign Ministry gave to the Perry Schlesinger Commission about what they wanted. And they wanted nuclear weapons to deter cyber threats. They wanted nuclear weapons to deter aggressive Chinese behavior over the Senkaku Islands. So Japan has a view of extended nuclear deterrence that goes beyond the original intention of the guarantee. The original guarantee was, if Japan is attacked with nuclear weapons, the United States promises to respond. But now the Japanese Foreign Ministry is pushing past that, and it wants to use the U.S. nuclear threat to deter other kinds of non-nuclear Chinese attacks. And I think that's where the problem is. I'm not sure where the U.S. government is coming down in those discussions, because 5 years ago, we submitted Freedom of Information Act requests to get some information about what's going on in those dialogues, and we haven't gotten a single piece of paper from State of Defense. So they're keeping it under very tight wraps. So anything you can do on the Japanese side to get some information from your government on the even if it's just questions in the diet to the foreign minister, would be a big help in sort of letting us know what exactly they're talking about in these meetings.
Thank you. Okay, let's take a question from the floor. Yes, please. To this one.
Yeah, this is just a reaction to Gregory. Okay, I'm from Nagasaki University. I'm Radumi Kompel at Tabunka Shakaigaku. So I just wanted to react to actually Japan was quite insecure. At least what I could perceive during the Trump administration, because Trump left Syria. Right, he set the path on leaving Afghanistan, which was later, and this was perceived as kind of abandoning the allies, right, and not just in words, because he was criticizing Japan, but really abandoning them. And you could see in Syria, there was Turkish troops started coming into Syria to replace American troops in there, and that was a concern. The Japanese were saying, no, we cannot be just allies. It's not enough, right? We need some kind of partnership, some kind of more commitment in order to get a commitment from the United States. So there was kind of there was a kind of sense of crisis towards American isolationism, and the American isolationism is a path of non-commitment, of not following the word of commitment to, for example, nuclear deterrence, which I do not think is the case. But there was a kind of crisis at that time during the Trump administration. So maybe have you perceived something like that, or if you have some comments on that?
We first became involved in the issue because of that memo. And it's been exclusively on the nuclear side. They call this the fear of abandonment in the US. And this is used by people like Kurt Campbell and the Japan hands in the State and Defense Department to argue for redeploying US tactical nuclear weapons in. So the United States actually likes to induce that fear, or these advocates of redeployment like to reinduce that fear to sort of obtain their policy goal. How real it is, of course, I'm not Japanese, so I can't know, which is one of the reasons we have this relationship. We're trying to bring Japanese voices, other Japanese voices than the handful of people at a few elite think tanks, but more Japanese voices to the US debate so that we can answer questions like this.
Thank you. Any other question from? Yes, please.
Thank you, Tatsu, and thank you for all the excellent presentations. And my question goes to Dylan. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm Kimiya Kawai from RECNA. I study international law. And I'm pretty interested in the presentation from Dylan because it's interesting to know that there is competition among 3 nuclear labs in the United States. And I'm also curious about to what extent the scientists in these 3 labs are aware of the international obligation like NPT Article 6 and other relevant treaties, which could affect the way of thinking of those scientists. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. I think the answer is that certainly at the managerial level, the lab directors and the heads of the programs in the labs are very aware of those obligations. But that represents a tiny minority amongst the complete workforce across the NNSA. I think most people doing the day-to-day work are not thinking about those things. And even many of the scientists, I think, are not thinking about those things. Most people come into the technical positions with very little experience or education, I think, in the political science or history or international relations aspects, particularly the history of arms control. And that's not something that is sort of part of a general introduction for people that enter that workforce, so they can easily remain unaware of it going forward. Again, it's certainly the case that the lab directors and directors of programs within the labs are in communication with State Department and NNSA and et cetera. But certainly I think, you know, these new weapons, the W87 one and the W93, pose a challenge to our obligations under the NPT. I don't think that's questioned internally. And with regards to the competition between the labs, you know, I think these modernization programs are often seen, if you think of the labs as kind of emblematic or similar to university research enterprises, within the labs they're almost like research departments that do specialized aspects of the research. And when there's money for a program like the new warhead, that money gets dispersed to those departments. And so I think it's easy for them to see it as a new funding source. Now we get to go do this set of experiments we've been thinking about. We get to buy this piece of equipment. We get to build this capability that we have wanted for other things. There's a lot of science that happens that gets squeezed in to these programmatic budgets in order to actually to do other experiments and other science. So it's, you know, much like if a university had a large donation, it would be taken advantage of to do a lot of things that had been on the desired list, right, for a long time. And the labs are good at doing that and actually doing things in parallel. There's also, I think, relatively little transparency at the ground level about what is funding what at the labs. So that's clear to the program directors, not always so clear to the people doing the work, where they're being paid for their time. And I think that certainly doesn't help encourage awareness of you know, the overall financial and bureaucratic structure that's driving it.
Okay, so time is running out, but I have one more question, very difficult question from the online audience. How do you think of the future possibility of that Israel might use or threat by its nuclear weapons if the Gaza armed conflict would expand to a fight against other Islam states? Is there anybody who wants to answer the question? Difficult.
I was just going to say one thing. So I'm not an expert on this issue, but I think the last week has unfortunately made a lot of us more aware of that issue than we were before. I think from a historical perspective, I was doing some reading the other day about the 1973 conflict, and sort of the argument or the possibility that U.S. interference, or U.S. Not interference, I guess, U.S. assistance to Israel was based on the fact that they were afraid that Israel was going to use a nuclear weapon that that not everyone knew they had at the time. And so I think that as this conflict, as it sort of gets is on the is borderline getting other states involved, getting Iran or Hezbollah having greater involvement, I think that you would hope that if the United States takes a similar perspective to that now, that maybe the communications that they're having with Israel are that they would essentially provide greater security guarantees and try to talk them down if it ever got to that. But hopefully that's not on the table even to begin with.
Thank you very much. Oh,
Well, I'm not sure I can. I'd like to answer more of an adjacent question to that, but thank you for bringing it up because I know it's on everyone's mind. It does illustrate quite clearly that nuclear weapons do not keep you safe. And if anyone has ever been mistaken about that, even over the past few years in all of our countries, the number of people who've died from a pandemic is enormous. Has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. They do nothing for you. And so the idea of human security, I think we shouldn't take our eye off the ball and keep worrying, keep imagining that nuclear weapons are the bedrock guarantor of safety. I am, of course, concerned. The attack that happened in Israel was, I think, of course, deeply, deeply wounding to not just the loss of life, but to their sense of security. And I do know that because of where Israel is and it's an environment, it has very capable lawyers. Sure, you've thought about the international humanitarian law aspect of this conflict very deeply. And all of those, all of the foundations that we use to constrain ourselves in times of crisis, I hope hold in these times. We can see already what's happening in Gaza. And I think it's going to strain, all these events have already strained the legal and humanitarian ways we try to constrain our worst impulses. So I would certainly hope that, of course, all of that Israel would never consider this. It wouldn't be useful in any case. It would do nothing, nothing to increase their security, and of course, certainly decrease it. So I would hope that at any time cooler heads would prevail, and we would recognize this. Nuclear weapons are not conferring security. In fact, undermine our security.
Thank you very much. That's a very good ending answer. Thank you. Let me close this session and get the microphone back to Keiko-san.
Thank you, Tatsu, and thank you very much for all wonderful panelists. So everyone, please give a big round of applause to them. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so finally, I would like to invite Dr. Gregory Clarkey for his final closing remark. But I would just like to say thank you for Gregory because, you know, of course you belong to the UCS as a China specialist, and also you have been serving as our honorable visiting professor to RECNA. So he has been serving like a wonderful bridge between the UCS and us, and also the bridge between the US, China, and Japan. And we have been learning a lot from him all the time, and then so great. So thank you. So Gregory, floor is yours.
That's really kind of you, Keiko, to say. Maybe a little too kind, but. Well, anyway, thanks to everyone here and everyone online for taking the time to participate this morning. We'd like to thank RECNA for organizing this event, especially on pretty short notice. And also, thanks for hosting me as a visiting fellow at RECNA and allowing me to be here in Japan, which has been just a wonderful personal experience as well as a productive professional experience. It's also allowed UCS to develop these relationships in East Asia that are critical to the success of the work of our program at the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And in this list of thanks, I have to thank these five for everything they've gone through in the last week. The natural scientists on that side and the social scientists on this side. It's interesting how it's separated out that way without any pre-planning. I'm really deeply grateful that you all decided to come. Were willing to take the time out of your schedules to come to Japan and to share, with critical audiences here what you have to bring to this debate. And as I said, the reason that's so important to our mission at UCS is we publish research and present papers, but we're not a think tank. We take that information and we actively lobby the U.S. government. And when we do that, we often hear that one of the reasons they can't make the changes we would like to see is because of pressure from Japan. and pressure from other countries in the region. So it's just so important that Japanese organizations like RECNA and US organizations like UCS work more closely together, and we're deeply grateful for this opportunity to take another step. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So this is the end of the session. Thank you very much for the all participants, and then thank you very much for the all people who attended this conference. Although this is a Monday morning in Japan, so thank you very much for the so many people attending online. Thank you very much for the great questions. Okay, so this is it. Thank you very much.